Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. North Korean strongman Kim Jong-Un met with Russian President Vladimir Putin on the Rusky Island in Vladivostok earlier today. Statements from both leaders described the 2-hour-long one-on-one meeting as fruitful. Putin said he and Kim exchanged opinions about what should be done to improve the situation. This is Kim's first meeting with a head of state after his February meeting in Hanoi with President Trump failed to break the deadlock on North Korea's nuclear weapons capability. Both sides have interest and are also signaling to the United States. Putin wants to counter United States influence, while Kim wants to indicate to the US that he has other regional options to play with. In an interview with China's official People's Daily, published on Thursday, Putin lashed out at countries claiming sole global leadership. And he said they carelessly trample on the norms and principles of international law, resort to blackmail, sanctions, and pressure, and try to force their values and dubious ideals on entire countries and populations, unquote. Putin is headed to China after his talks with Kim for another summit. Kim is also concerned about North Korean labor force working in Russia, whose numbers have been dropping and are likely to drop further by the end of the year as a 2017 UN sanctions resolution takes effect. The labor force gets Pyongyang about $500 million in foreign exchange. Food shortage is another of Kim's concern. The Vladivostok meeting follows repeated invitations from Putin since Kim embarked on a series of diplomatic overtures last year. Since March 2018, Kim Jong-Un has held 4 meetings with Chinese President Xi Jinping, 3 with South Korea's Moon Jae-in, 2 with Trump, and 1 with the Vietnamese president. To discuss this further, we have with us David Sedney, who is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia and in a separate tenure for Afghanistan. We also have Lucy Taylor, who joins us from Moscow, and Claudia Astarita, who is a political analyst based in Paris. If I begin with Lucy, since you're on the ground, what is Putin's play here?
Well, Vladimir Putin spoke to journalists after this meeting. He said that it had been productive and successful. He discussed, of course, the main reason for this meeting, which was to look for a way forward in those negotiations over denuclearization in North Korea, whether Kim Jong-un could ever be persuaded to give up his nuclear weapons in return for the lifting of economic sanctions, which are strangling the economy there. He said that all sides, from the US to Russia to North Korea, wanted to reduce the risk of nuclear conflict. But he said that Mr. Kim was going to need more assurances from the international community before he would be willing to do that, assurances over his security and sovereignty. One small surprise was that he appeared to back the discussions between Donald Trump and Chairman Kim. He said that those bilateral talks were the only way, but that assurances from the United States alone, even if they were to come, even if an agreement were to be reached, might not be enough to satisfy Chairman Kim. And at that point, it might be worth expanding the negotiations out to involve the 6 nations which were previously involved in negotiations. That would also include Russia, China, Japan, South Korea as well, and that Chairman Kim was going to need those assurances from the international community before he would make any further moves to get rid of his nuclear weapons.
Okay, so what we are witnessing here, for instance, and I'm sure Kim Jong-un is also observing that, is separately the JCPOA, the multilateral deal that the US did with Iran, and from where the US unilaterally pulled back. And of course, we are now looking at a very tight sanctions regime against Iran. So do you think that North Korea would not be concerned about the fact that regardless of how many states get involved, for instance, if we're talking about going back to the 6-party framework, that the US at some point would pull back? And, you know, there is already a precedent here, for instance, with reference to the 94 agreed framework, which, for instance, during Bush Bush's period, when John Bolton was then Under Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. He said that because, this was about the spent fuel rods and all that, if you go back to that time. And he said, this was the hammer I was looking for to shatter the agreed framework. Now, this kind of approach is something that obviously concerns the weaker states who might be at some point be prepared to get into a multilateral agreement.
I'm sure that is a concern for Chairman Kim, and I think that's one of the reasons he's come here to Russia today seeking new partners after that meeting with Donald Trump in Hanoi in February broke down. It didn't appear to end very well then. There was no agreement reached. It seemed to end prematurely, the meeting with Donald Trump. Today's meeting seems to have gone a lot better. The one-to-one talks between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-Un lasted for twice as long as they were scheduled to, suggesting that these two men are building a good relationship. It's the first time they've met in person. So it does feel as though Chairman Kim is reaching out to new allies, trying to forge, although these two countries do have a historically friendly ties, trying to forge new allies for these negotiations going forwards to try to ramp up the pressure on the United States. And I think also probably drawing China into that as well, trying to gather as many allies around him as he can to try to have new voices lobbying on behalf of Russia. And Vladimir Putin hinted that he would like a bigger role in these negotiations. He said that he would be briefing the Chinese leadership on his visit to Beijing this weekend. And he said that Chairman Kim had asked him directly to speak to the United States about the outcomes of this meeting as well. So it does seem as though Russia is willing to step into that role of mediating or lobbying for North Korea in the world, probably to try to satisfy the concerns that you're talking about.
Okay, thank you. That was Lucy Taylor talking to us from Moscow. David, I know we have discussed this before with reference to Iran. And I also know that you personally also thought that the Iran deal was not particularly a good deal for the United States. And of course, that's a controversial statement. But the point really is that that is something which obviously raises concerns among states that are perhaps would want to negotiate with the United States, but then would not be sure of when the US would actually break off, or having gotten into some kind of framework or some kind of agreement would pull back. So that's like bad credit rating, no?
Well, clearly this was a situation where for both Kim Jong-un and for Vladimir Putin, the meeting itself was the event, was the win. Both of them are strengthened by having a relatively positive, or actually a quite positive meeting, having a meeting where both are seen as reasonable and looking for a way forward, when the last meeting between Kim Jong-un and President Trump ended very poorly. Vladimir Putin is still trying to recover from, and Russia are trying to recover from the sanctions put on Russia following the invasion of Crimea. Russia wants to play a bigger role in the world stage. Russia is not the answer to the North Korean problem, but just by playing this role, Russia is stepping back into the big power role that it wants to. And for Kim Jong-un, both domestically and internationally, the fact that he can sit down with Vladimir Putin and have this kind of positive meeting puts him in a more advantageous position vis-a-vis Washington. I think going back to your point about the JCPOA in Iran, I think it is clear to all involved, and including the smaller countries, as you said, that it's important not just to rely on discussions with the United States, but to also have as wide a range of other partners as possible. Kim Jong-un tried the one-on-one role with Trump. It didn't work. So now he's going to go back to something, perhaps the six-party talks that President Putin mentioned so positively following the discussions with Kim Jong-un. So again, this is a win for Russia. This is a win for North Korea. It diminishes somewhat the role of the U.S., but in the end, the U.S. is the key player that Kim Jong-un has to deal with. And he is going to assemble Russia, China, and others to work with the on the United States to try and get a deal that is more suited to North Korean national interest.
So you think that this is going back to a multilateral framework, and the fact that the bilaterals between Trump and Kim did not really work out?
Well, bilaterals will always have their place, but I think it is clear from what President Putin said that what both he and Kim Jong-Un think are necessary are broader international guarantees, as well as something from the United States and something done in an international framework. And the revival of the six-party talks that President Putin was talking about may well be the way forward here if the United States is willing to go along, and that is a big if.
Okay, that's a big if. So assuming there are six-party talks, of course, we're jumping ahead of the curve, but as I said, assuming that it happens, what is the irreducible minimum that the United States would be looking for in terms of beginning to normalize with North Korea?
Well, that is the real nub of the issue. The United States wants complete denuclearization of North Korea, and North Korea wants to go on a step-by-step process with, according to most analysts, without a real commitment to, in the end, give up all of its nuclear weapons. The United States wants to front-load the process, have serious steps towards denuclearization taken before any lifting of sanctions. North Korea wants there to be a step-by-step process, including essentially rewards for things that don't make a difference, including rewards for rhetoric rather than action. So there's a huge gap there. And that's why the six-party talks foundered over a decade ago. It's why the Trump-Kim Jong-Un summit failed as well. So even with these guarantees, even with a return to the six-party talks, the fact that there is a major gap between what the United States wants and is willing to accept and what North Korea is willing to offer, that is really no closer to getting to the resolution of that core problem than we were before this meeting.
So what leaves the space here for negotiations then?
I think the space for negotiations is whether North Korea can move more towards actions and whether the United States is willing to relax sanctions in a gradual way. And because the sanctions are United Nations sanctions and require the cooperation, most importantly of China, but also of Russia, who are the most important neighboring countries in terms of implementing the sanctions, it gives those two countries some leverage. At the same time, North Korea has been very adamant that it won't take the steps that are necessary to satisfy the United States. So I think a step-by-step approach is where the space is, but whether there can be success is still a very open question.
No, but okay, I understand what you're saying. But if the U.S. were to front-load this with, with certain conditions, then the step-by-step approach is not going to start.
Exactly. It's not worked so far because the United States wants actions from North Korea before lifting of sanctions, and North Korea is not willing to make the kind of steps that the U.S. has asked for. So whether that can be reached or not, with the kind of international guarantees, with the kind of cooperation from Russia now, as well as China, whether a more active role by these two countries will move the United States and North Korea closer is an open question. But the direct talks method that Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump tried didn't work. And at the same time, North Korea does need relaxation of the sanctions. The impact on North Korean economy is very severe. And going back to your point about Iran, the recent tightening of U.S. sanctions on Iran shows that the United States does have determination and is willing to take steps that many people thought it was not willing to take. So I think North Korea does have some incentive to move forward. But again, a very difficult road ahead.
Okay, let me go to Claudia Astarita, who joins us from Paris. Claudia, what do you think? Where is the space for negotiations? You heard what David Sedney said. Tell me, is it possible to go back to what was at one time called the agreed framework back in the early 90s? Do you think that could be a starting point, or whether that is now a lost chapter altogether?
Well, going back to the six-party talks is a bit complicated. First of all, because the six-party talks were a China-led initiative.
Yeah.
So going back to a similar system would be recognizing that China is playing a major role in the negotiation. I'm not sure that the United States want to do that. Another problem is that the other option would be Kim Jong-un trying to convince more and more countries such as China, South Korea, and Russia were already at his side, and now Japan is the only one missing, if we go back to the original six-party talk membership, that negotiation could continue even without the United States. So imagine that these countries decide on their own to partially release some sanctions or not to respect the sanction as the Americans are asking them to do. So this could create some opening, but in this case, the opening would be very risky because it would be taken as a sort of personal affront to the United States line. At the same time, we know that in most of the cases, negotiation happen behind the curtain. So it is possible that by facilitating dialogue between the United States and China and Russia and with the mediation of South Korea, the United States might realize that there is this consensus on trying to do to implement a step-by-step approach. In that case, I think a little bit of, let's say, guarantees to the United States could be maintained by creating a system in which automatic reinstallment of sanctions will be reinstalled in case North Korea doesn't respect the condition for the release of sanctions. So this, I think, could be slightly more acceptable for the United States. Or another option in terms of reopening negotiation would be allowing South Korea to try. So South Korea to start some cooperative agreement, cooperative initiative with North Korea. So only the two of them, and see whether North Korea would respond in a very peaceful and constructive way to this kind of opening. And then in case this happens, then make a step forward with more broad and global release of sanctions, but still on a step-by-step basis, I think.
Okay, that's a very interesting question. So, yes, the South Koreans are obviously very interested. And the South Korean president and Kim Jong-un have also met. But the sense from the United States was that Washington wasn't particularly happy with South Korea taking the lead in a way which kind of pushed the US to the sidelines. So do you think if the South-North bilaterals could move forward, that the US would be satisfied with that, or the US would want to be part of that? How do you think the US is going to operate?
Look, I think that Kim Jong-un has already proved that it will continue, that the negotiations are not only in the hands of the United States. And I think that the United States needs to accept that, because otherwise they will risk to lose the control over the negotiation. So I agree. I mean, the United States tend not to agree with anything that goes against their initial proposal. But at the same time, Trump needs a deal as well. I mean, it would be extremely powerful from a political and a strategic perspective for Donald Trump to reach a deal with North Korea and to be the leader even of a coalition, even of a multilateral negotiation that is reaching a deal with North Korea. So if that's the goal, they need to be pragmatic as well, and they need to find a way to accept to make even very limited step backward, because otherwise, if they remain so strong and so let's say strict on respecting their position, then they won't achieve anything, and then they will probably pass the leadership to China or to another country, which is not what they want.
Okay, that's an interesting. I'm going to take a short break, but at the other end of the break, we'll continue with our discussion of North Korea's weapons capability, and negotiations with the United States in the backdrop of President Putin and Kim Jong-un's meeting today. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing President Putin and Kim Jong-un's meeting today. We're also joined by Dr. Leonid Petrov from Sedney. Thank you, Dr. Petrov. What do you make of this? We were earlier discussing what exactly does it mean, what's in it for President Putin and also for Kim Jong-un. So there are certain interests involved, but there's also a thought that this might be a sort of precursor to going back to the involvement of more state parties, a la what we saw, the six-party talks earlier, which broke down. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that it was important for President Putin and Supreme Leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, to meet face-to-face. It hasn't happened before. I think it has been long overdue. They should have done it earlier, but better later than never. And they did it in Russia. First time Kim Jong-un visited Russia on his train. So the relationship between Russia and North Korea have been functioning to some degree, but the major point is the economic links, and obviously Putin and Kim were discussing this during that one day of New York summit. And of course the denuclearization of North Korea, which has been going on since the early 2000s, when North Koreans detonated the first nuclear device in 2006. Russia was very worried because the city of Vladivostok is just 600 kilometers away from the nuclear testing site. Russia really needs North Korea to be non-nuclear, peaceful, and economically prosperous. And this is what both Kim Jong-un and President Putin have been discussing today. I'm sure this dialogue will continue. Whether it's going to happen in a bilateral format, like Kim Jong-un did with President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping of China and President Moon Jae-in of South Korea, everything was done in a bilateral format. So the same happened today, when Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin met behind the closed doors. Whether the format is going to change into multilateral, like it used to be 10 years ago, the so-called six-party talks, well, there's some pros and cons for that. I think it's much more convenient to discuss the difficult questions in a bilateral format, rather than having six parties sitting at the same table and demanding something what the other parties don't want to hear, for example. So I think there should be a combination of multilateral and bilateral diplomatic process, and we saw this today. President Putin is already in his way to China, where he is going to brief the president of China, Xi Jinping, about what he had discussed with Kim Jong-un, and I'm sure President Putin actually confirmed he will inform the American partners about the results of today's summit as well.
Okay, so do you think that China and Russia are now planning to take the lead in essentially dealing with North Korea? That's one question. Secondly, with reference to denuclearization, you think that North Korea, without some ironclad security guarantees, would essentially agree to rolling back its weapons capability?
Well, of course, for Russia and China, who are immediate neighbors to North Korea, it is very important. It's a very acute issue. If something terrible happens during the nuclear test or a launch of intercontinental ballistic missiles is faulty, both countries are going to suffer. So, of course, Beijing and Moscow are primarily concerned about resolving the issue, and I think China has proposed a freeze for a freeze, gradual approach where both sides, North Koreans and Americans and South Koreans, would do step-by-step de-escalation. And this is what we saw last year. North Koreans accepted the moratorium, unilaterally stopped launching rockets and testing nuclear devices. And South Koreans and Americans also decided to scale down on and even cancel the joint military exercises which were happening on the peninsula for the last 25, 30 years. So it looks like there's a positive dynamics, and I think Putin-Kim Summit actually tried to consolidate these positive developments in the peninsula, and also encourage Kim Jong-Un to continue the moratorium, and also to promise some help and aid at the international fora like United Nations Security Council, where China and Russia permanent representatives, permanent members, they are able to raise the issue of sanctions and at least propose the partial elevation and partial easing of sanctions. Okay. Whether President Trump is going to accept this and other countries of the allies of the United States are going to accept this is another issue. I'm not sure that China and Russia could do it unilaterally.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Leonid Petrov, for speaking with us. I'm also joined by Ambassador Zamir Akram. I will go to Ambassador Akram, but quickly back to David Sedney. David, if Russia and China are also concerned about North Korea's weapons capability, then obviously that's a point of convergence between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. And do you think that could be exploited in terms of, dealing with Pyongyang?
It certainly has that possibility. I think Vladimir Putin, following the talks today, made clear that he is going to reach out to President Trump and brief him, as well as going on to China and talking to President Xi Jinping. This new role for Russia as an intermediary, as a broker, does help Putin at home, helps Putin internationally. So I think there is some prospect for that. But in the end, the United States is an essential part of these. It is the United States military, the United States nuclear umbrella over South Korea that is the biggest single concern North Korea has. So the talks have to involve the United States as a key player. And the open question here is whether Russia and China can play a useful intermediary role, given all the other tensions that those two countries have with the United States in so many other areas. So it's a complicated area, but as I said earlier, what happened today is a win for Putin and a win for Kim Jong-un, a little bit of a setback for the U.S., but that doesn't mean that this is the end of the road at all. There's still a long way to go. Okay.
Ambassador Akram, there was the meeting between President Putin and Kim Jong-un. What do you make of this? As David Sedney just said, this is a win for Putin, also a win for Kim, and a little bit of setback for the United States, but that the U.S. obviously retains its central position in terms of dealing with North Korea. What's your sense about what happened today?
Well, I basically agree with that assessment. I think it's clear that President Putin's objective was to put Russia across as a major global player in every issue around the world, and this is one major issue in the Korean Peninsula. So he certainly has demonstrated that Russia is a party to this issue, and Russia is now back to being a superpower. And for the North Korean leader, it was important to also demonstrate that North Korea is not alone, his regime is not alone, that he has powerful friends and supporters in President Putin as well as in President Xi of China. The American-North Korean dialogue met with a setback, but I think it's probably a temporary setback when their talks collapsed in Vietnam. But I think that the real problem is what kind of security guarantees is the U.S. Japan and South Korea willing to give to the North Koreans in order for North Koreans to actually activate denuclearization of their own. So far, the moratorium has held, but if things deteriorate between the U.S. and North Korea, then perhaps the moratorium would not hold. So the real essential issue is what kind of guarantees are available for the North Koreans for them to give up their nuclear weapons program.
Now, here's the problem. I'd earlier referred to what the U.S. did with the JCPOA with reference to Iran, unilaterally pulling back. There was also the agreed framework where both sides, North Korea and the United States, were supposed to do certain things. And with reference to those steps that were to be taken, for instance, Robert Galushi, who was the one negotiating from the U.S. side and who signed the framework, said he told the U.S. Congress that the North Koreans have always been disappointed that more has not been done by the U.S. And I'm quoting from what he said. So the point really is that given this trust deficit and given also the fact that obviously North Koreans are also observing what's happening with Iran, do you think this whole idea of moving this forward, especially on the basis of complete disarmament, nuclear disarmament of North Korea, can even, is it even possible? Will it cut?
Well, you're exactly right. There is a huge trust deficit because the North Koreans think that they were given certain promises which were not kept by the U.S. And the Iranian example is a very good one. And that certainly is not something that the North Koreans are going to fall for. So when I say that what kind of assurances, it has to be assurances that will be acceptable to North Korea, to Pyongyang. And I don't think that they will be giving up the nuclear weapons option totally and completely, which is what the Americans are looking for, is a complete reversal of their nuclear program. I don't think that they will be willing to do that, but I think that they will be willing to give some kind of, willing to come to some kind of an arrangement in which there is a lid on this program. But I don't think that they are going to completely roll it back or reverse it completely.
Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador Akram, for speaking with us. Claudia, what do you think of what Ambassador Akram said? That it's very unlikely that North Korea will roll back the program or completely let go of the nuclear option. And of course, also the missiles that they have, especially the longer range ICBMs. Do you think that short of this complete rollback, there is space for capping the program of the United States to accept that?
Well, I agree that it would be very difficult to convince North Korea to abandon its nuclear program completely. Also because North Korea, when Kim Jong-Un became the new leader, he changed the constitution to declare North Korea as a nuclear power. So it is there, of course, it was done for maintaining the support over the society. It was a populist move, if you like, but it is there. And it is crucial for him and his consensus to guarantee that North Korea is and will remain forever a nuclear power. Although North Korea needs some guarantees in terms of security to try to slow down the program or to accept to keep it frozen, but the rest of the United States also needs guarantees that North Korea will not use its nuclear capacity anymore. I think one way to compromise could be possibly allowing inspectors to regularly assess North Korean nuclear capacities. And again, it's very hard, especially consider past experience, to trust what North Korean leaders say. And even if they commit to do something, I think it would remain very hard to say, oh, okay, now we can feel safe because they have committed or because they have signed a compromise, they have signed an agreement or whatever. At the same time, I believe that allowing North Korea to become economically stronger, so allowing North Korea to engage economically with the rest of the world, and at the same time giving Kim Jong-un more visibility all over the world, because apparently this is something he's very interesting in, could be another way to put him in a situation in which he won't risk to lose what he has achieved just for the sake of proving that he maintains a nuclear capacity.
Okay, so in terms of denuclearization, there is obviously a difference in interpreting what denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula actually means. From the US side, it obviously means the North Korean rollback of its weapons capability. From the North Korean side, this also means that the extended deterrence that the US provides to South Korea is something that needs to go for the Korean Peninsula's complete denuclearization. Now, how is it going to play out if, for instance, the North Koreans say, fine, we are going to roll back, and we are just making an assumption here, but that the extended deterrence also has to go. Do you think the US would accept that?
I think that there are already some positive signs from this perspective with the joint exercises that were not performed for several months, just to avoid adding fuel to the tension. So I think this is actually very good. I think in a way the United States could agree to reduce their presence. So again, if you continue with the philosophy that the step-by-step approach might work, this could be another way to give some guarantees that to North Korea that the United States will progressively step back from their military position in the region. Although, again, it would be impossible, I think, to convince Washington to renounce to their military positions in South Korea and in Japan, not only because of North Korea, but also because of China. So, and today more than ever, they want to stay there. So again, it's really a matter of compromise on details and just reaching a deal out of little concession made from one side to the other and vice versa, I think.
Okay. David, Sedney, same to you. Total denuclearization, which also involves the US nuclear umbrella also goes. Would that be acceptable?
Well, I don't think it would be acceptable, and I also don't think it's possible. The United States has a worldwide nuclear capability. There is no way for the United States to somehow exclude the Korean Peninsula from the reach of its nuclear weapons because, as Claudia was just saying, the U.S. has concerns about China and about Russia as well. The United States has treaty commitments to Japan. So the idea that somehow there would be a bubble over the Korean Peninsula that would be immune to any kind of U.S. retaliation for North Korean aggression in the future just doesn't seem to be practical. So the North Koreans are asking for something that really doesn't exist. The U.S. is asking for something very concrete and practical, the removal of North Korean nuclear weapons. I think what President Putin said after the talks today, some kind of security guarantees, stronger international security guarantees, are the way to go to try and address those North Korean concerns. But because it is still not clear that North Korea is willing to move towards complete denuclearization of its nuclear weapons, the composition of those security guarantees is something that there's not been really a lot of work done on. And perhaps that is an area where work can be done before concrete steps are taken. We'll have to see what happens when President Putin talks to President Xi and the two of them talk to President Trump. Clearly, there's the possibility of an opening. And maybe it'll come to pass. But getting to the real solution of the problem, it will be much more difficult.
Okay. David, let me assail it from another angle. Technically speaking, the US and North Korea are still at war. There was an armistice. There's never been a declaration that the war has ended. So perhaps for the talks to proceed, or for trying to sort of lessen the trust deficit, could the two sides actually begin with a declaration that the war has ended? Do you think that is possible, or is it too fantastic to talk about?
Well, first of all, technically, the United States is not at war with North Korea. The military operations in Korea were under the United Nations. And on the peninsula right now, the U.S. forces are under the United Nations command, which is commanded by a U.S. general, which goes back to the approval by the UN Security Council of the military operations in Korea, which Russia was absent from the Security Council when that happened. So the United States is not technically at war with North Korea. It's the United Nations command, and the United Nations that is the practical one. Could the U.S. and North Korea sign some kind of an agreement to say that the hostilities on the peninsula are over? Certainly. But that would have to be something that comes about only after there are serious steps by denuclearization. The United States is not going to give the North Koreans something that they've been seeking for a long time without real actions on the part of North Korea first.
Would you agree with me that one of the problems with not being able to find enough space to take the negotiations further is the fact that the U.S. front loads them with too many conditions as far as the North Koreans are concerned?
Not at all. If you look back at what's happened over the years, you've referenced a number of times the agreed framework. The agreed framework fell apart because North Korea didn't keep its word. North Korea had a highly enriched uranium program, which it didn't disclose in the negotiations of the agreed framework, which it continued to deny. And it was only after the United States brought irrefutable proof of that to the fore that North Korea admitted.
But David, there were also certain things that the U.S. was supposed to do, whether it was the light water thing, reactor thing, number of, the power that was to be provided to North Korea, the sanctions regime, which was supposed to be lifted. They were only lifted, some of them were lifted in 2008, although they had become less since 2000. So there were a number of things that the U.S. was also supposed to do. And as I quoted Robert Galushi saying to the Congress that the North Koreans think that the U.S. has not done enough on its side. So I think that there are things on both sides. It's not just about the North Koreans.
I think you'll have to just go back and check your history on that. The fact that it was the existence, the proven existence of the highly enriched uranium program, which was at the heart of the end of the agreed framework. And in terms of the agreed framework, the United States, Japan, South Korea spent a lot of money moving forward on that light water reactor. And it all fell apart because at the core, North Korea was not willing to give up its nuclear and missile ambitions. And that is why, because of that experience in the past, that anything moving forward now has to be based on North Korean actions. The United States has taken a number of actions in recent months, including, as Claudia mentioned, the suspension of exercises with the South Korean forces. So I think there are even more confidence-building steps on both sides that can be taken, but they have to be actual concrete steps. Sanctions will not be lifted just for promises alone.
Okay, and that's where, as previously John Bolton said, this was the hammer I was looking for to shatter the agreed framework. Thank you so much, David Sedney. Thank you, Claudia Astarita, for talking to us. This is all for today. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.